thank you very much, and thank you for coming, or should I say, thank you for being blown here by the wind. If you've been cycling like I have today, it's been quite an extraordinary day, so thank you for coming despite the weather. So this is one of my favourite times of every term, and it's the Churchill College Book Club. And I want to welcome my guest this evening, Professor Dame Diane Coyle. So Diane is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. She's a Research Director of the Bennett School of Public Policy and a Fellow of Churchill College. Her own research focuses on the economics of AI and digital and on economic measurement. Her latest book is The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. Diane has been writing about the digital revolution since her first book, which is The Weightless World, published in 1997. And Diane tells me she's busy writing another book now. So the underlying motivation is the question, what does it mean for the economy to improve, and who benefits? Diane is currently a member of the UK government's Industrial Strategy Council, advises the Competition and Markets Authority, and has served previously in a number of public service roles, including as Vice Chair of the BBC Trust, a member of the Competition Commission, the Natural Capital Committee, and most recently, the New Towns Task Force. So Diane was awarded a DBE in 2023 for her contribution to economics and public policy. She was a student at Brasenose College, Oxford, reading PPE, and has a PhD in economics from Harvard. So, turning to the book we're going to be discussing tonight, the framing for the book is that the ways that statisticians and governments measure the economy was developed in the 1940s, and when the urgent economic problems were entirely different from those of today. Diane argues that the framework underpinning today's economic statistics is so outdated that it functions as a distorting lens. So tonight, we will hear about the case for a new framework, one that takes into consideration current economic realities. So with that, we can begin the conversation. So a very warm welcome. And I'm going to start by, I'm not an economist, and I'm going to start by asking you, why is economic statistics interesting and important?
Well, David Spiegelhalter isn't here, I don't think, this evening, so I can tell the joke about you can tell if a statistician is an extrovert by the fact he looks at your shoes, not theirs, when he's talking to you. People think it's a very nerdy subject. I think it's incredibly important. And we tend to think that the world shapes what we measure and how we understand what's going on, but it's also the other way around. How we classify things, how we understand things, shapes the world as well. And I do have this nice image of me looking very smug in Chetham's library in Manchester a few years ago, holding the copy of William Petty's Political Arithmetic that was used by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels when they were writing the Communist Manifesto during that year, sitting in Manchester in 1842. So there's that famous line in Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto that to change the world, you have to understand it. And they have all the emphasis on the change. I'm on the understanding, but I just think it's these statistics and the power of numbers in determining things in modern life that makes it so important. So it seems as though it's about really boring measurement stuff. It's actually about the conceptual framework and how you understand what's going on.
Yeah. So there's sort of academics and so on in the audience, people who are well read. If you were to go up to someone in the street, for example, and say, why is economic statistics important? If you wanted to educate them, what would you say? What impact might it have in their daily life if you stopped somebody in the street and said, this is what I study, it's important because ...
Well, in the UK at the moment, the measurement of GDP determines what the Chancellor thinks is available to spend on mending the potholes or funding adult social care. So there's a very immediate line from measuring GDP to daily life. How comfortable is daily life?
Yes.
It affects all kinds of social policy, economic policy, and this single number of GDP growth has become dominant in economies across the world. And that's what I argue is distorting a lot of decisions that are being made now.
Yeah, okay. Well, we could do with some some potholes being fixed. I have to say, Madingley Road is it's got lots of potholes, and so
Not great when it's so windy.
Yes. Okay, so that sounds like it's a very important subject. But if we take a step back for a minute, how did you actually get into this topic in the first place?
It started with the digital journey. I mean, as you mentioned, I started writing about this back in the 1990s. And I was a journalist at the time on the Independent newspaper, and they sent me to cover the flotation of the UK's first internet service provider. And they had a suite at the Savoy, which companies did when they were floating. And they had a webcam on the Golden Gate Bridge, so you could see the traffic in San Francisco. And I thought, this is completely amazing. So I started thinking about it, and quite quickly came to realize that the technology was changing the economy in ways that we were not measuring well. So I got into the measurement through being so interested in the effects of digital technology. I wrote a book about GDP, a history of GDP. Another great book, it's got jokes, if you want to buy more than one. And the revelation for me then was, as an economist, was that GDP wasn't an object in the world that we go out and measure. It's an idea.
Yeah.
And it's an idea that dates back to the Second World War. It was constructed for the needs of that time. It was constructed for an economy that was mainly manufacturing, the value of ideas, intellectual property, data, that hadn't even begun at the time. And its definition has changed multiple times since the Second World War. So it's an idea, it's a really powerful idea, and that was the route that got me interested. And everybody knows it's got some quirks. Some of them are very well known. Some of them are the one about you marry your cleaner and that reduces GDP because you're no longer paying them. A couple of others, if I may quiz the audience a little bit. These supermarket checkouts now, the automatic checkouts, let's take a vote. Who thinks this decreases GDP? And who thinks it increases GDP? Ooh, people are a bit uncertain. We're going to have to get more familiar with the GDP thing, aren't we? So these are part of a technology journey that supermarkets have been making over time. Back in the 1950s, if you were shopping, you would go to the greengrocer and the butcher, and everything would be behind the counter. You'd ask for what you wanted. And so the labour of the butcher or the greengrocer was paid for through the goods, and there was very little capital involved, very little capital equipment. Supermarkets came along, they installed checkouts. They used to have people who would put your groceries in a bag at the end, so they were paid, but there was a little bit of labour, you took it off the shelf yourself. Scroll on, and now we have these automatic checkouts, and for the supermarkets, they are paying fewer human beings. They've installed more capital equipment. That investment will count in GDP. But we're substituting our free labour. So we're doing more of the work. And that's been the transition over time from paid employment to investment in capital plus free labour. So it's a slightly tricky question because it's not clear what it does to GDP. It will improve the measure of supermarkets' productivity, but only because we are doing that work for them. Next question. Bombing Iran with these fighter planes, does that increase or decrease GDP? Who thinks it will increase US GDP? Who thinks it will decrease US GDP? So it's both. In the short term, they're going to have to spend a lot more money on replacing the missiles and so on that they're using. Production will ramp up. In the short term, war increases GDP growth. It was part of the way we got out of the effects of high unemployment during the Depression in the 1930s by the war effort ramping up. Longer term, though, it destroys assets, it diverts productive capacity from other things, it reduces people's purchasing power so they buy less. So there's an immediate increase in GDP growth and then a decrease. And similarly for things that damage the environment, like natural disasters, there's a short-term boost, and long-term, you've lost the assets, and so growth decreases.
That's fascinating. Going back to the supermarket, I couldn't leave this idea that whether this calculation of GDP had also factored in things like theft, because theft has increased because we are serving ourselves now. So presumably that calculation has all been taken in, what doesn't go through the till but goes out through the door. So I'm sure it does, but it doesn't just change, capital plus labour. It changes the way we behave, I think, as well.
It changes behaviour, and that's a redistribution. And so that's a redistribution from the shareholders and customers of supermarkets to the people stealing the goods. So there's a redistributive effect going on there as well.
Yeah. So these complex changes that we're seeing taking place, they are complicated to work out, and GDP, I'm sure, has to factor in sort of sociology and social behaviour.
Well, in theory, it clearly changes in response to behaviour. The measurement of it year by year or quarter by quarter is defined as the activity that goes on in the economy. In principle, things like theft or hacking that involve monetary transactions are counted in GDP. And there was a period when the definition changed to include illegal transactions. And so countries that had a lot of illegal transactions or an underground economy suddenly saw a jump in their GDP as a result of that. Italy was one example. And that has the consequence that you can borrow more money in the debt markets because your GDP is higher. So
A counter incentive, isn't it, somehow?
It is.
But, okay. So you're arguing that GDP is not a good measure of the size and health of a country's economy over a period, and it's really decreasingly helpful in today's economy. So what we really want to know is really to help us explore what you would do instead, and that's the basis of your book, actually. So tell us more. What's going to be better?
Well, part of the argument in the book is that even on its own terms, GDP is a decreasingly good measure of the economy. And a lot of that is because of structural and technical change. There's the example in the news is clearly the conflict in Iran and what's happening to oil not being able to get through the Straits of Hormuz. So people have understood that this is going to affect the supply chain in the energy market. It turns out, though, that the countries that export through the Strait of Hormuz are big suppliers of fertilizer. 35-40% of the materials needed for fertilizer. And then we learn that it's sulfur. And so every crisis that we've had in recent years has pointed out supply chain vulnerabilities that we don't know about because they're not well captured in the statistics. And the floods in Thailand disrupted the automotive supply chain. We saw the same energy shocks happening in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So even understanding the pattern of production in the world, now we have these extended global supply chains. We're very vulnerable because we don't know what they are. They're not captured.
And we
in
heard
the
all
headline
about
metrics.
that from Tim Minchell, who's in the audience, about Your Life is Manufactured.
Absolutely.
We heard all about the fragility of global supply chains and how complex it is.
And Tim's book is another excellent book. So another example, I personally added 0.2 percentage points to UK GDP growth for a number of years by changing the measure of the price we use to deflate telecoms services with colleagues from the Office of National Statistics. Now, this sounds a bit esoteric, so bear with me. The GDP measure that we look at is real GDP, which means that it's adjusted for price increases because we want to understand purchasing power. It's called real. It's not real, really. It's made up, but we call it real GDP. So you need a price index that captures what is just inflation in the price of particular services. Looking at telecom services, in about 2017, the Telecoms Engineering Institute came to the Office of National Statistics and said, you're showing that our price index is flat. And that can't be true, because over the past 7 years, we have had amazing technological progress. We've improved compression, latency has improved, we get a lot more stuff, and we just see this explosion in data usage because everybody's on their smartphones. Why is that not showing up as a reduction in the quality-adjusted price of telecom services? And ONS said, we know somebody who's really nerdy about statistics who can help us with that. And so we constructed an alternative price index. Now, this is a little bit complicated because telecom services include your voice calls, your SMS messages, your WhatsApp, your streaming Netflix, and so on. So there's a whole bundle of different services that need combining together. How are you going to weight them together? Normally, these indices use revenues, but telecoms companies make more money from voice calls per byte of data just because we're slow to switch. We should all not be using voice calls, we should be using WhatsApp because it will cost us much less money, but people are slow to change. So if you use revenue weights, that's not really telling you what the benefit, what the economic value consumers are getting is really. If you use volume, that assumes that every byte of data is equally valuable. And that probably isn't true either, because we like watching Netflix movies better than we like phoning up the GP. So what to do? If you look at these indices, you get a range. So the index was flat. We got a range from minus 45% to minus 90% using these different weights. It's just not clear what the right answer is. Office for National Statistics, being quite cautious people, went for 0.45% decline, and that's added 0.2 percentage points to GDP growth. So it underlines that this is just an idea, but also underlines the thinking that needs to go on about what do these structural changes in the economy mean for how we measure what's going on, and this figure that we all pay so much attention to.
Yes.
Loads of other examples. The free goods, search or ChatGPT for free, that's not counted, and yet everybody's using it all the time. What should we do with that? Absolutely no consensus about what to do with it. Or you'll have seen the cartoon about the internet, which has all this complicated stuff, which rests on a little pipe at the bottom, and that pipe is maintained by a volunteer. And there's so much open source value. None of that is measured. And yet if we had to replace all of that with paid for labour and data, it would cost trillions of dollars to replace it. So there's just this whole swathe of digital value that we're not measuring.
Yeah. And actually nothing is ever for free, is it? So there's a cost there somewhere. So
I do have another quiz, if I may.
Please do.
So there's this phenomenon called factoryless goods production, which is linked to global supply chains, and it's companies that have a brand or a design, but they don't manufacture the thing themselves. So here's the quiz. Does ARM make chips? Who thinks yes? No, you all know the answer is no, it designs them. Does Apple make iPhones?
Yes.
No. All the design, all the software, that's Apple, but they are manufactured actually in many countries, and the components shipped for assembly to China or to India increasingly. Does Mercedes-Benz make the F-Class Mercedes-Benz?
I'm frightened to say yes for anything, but does anybody want to have a go?
Call out, yes or no? Yes. No. It makes some cars, but not this particular one. This is contracted out to a plant in Austria, I think. Does Rolls-Royce make aero engines? Yes.
I was going to say no, because there's such a trend going on here.
But Rolls-Royce makes more than half its revenues and profits from the services it sells around the engines, the monitoring in real time, the preventive maintenance and so on, rather than selling the engines. I mean, it is, I'm sure Tim has been there, but it's a fantastic factory up in Derby, which you have to drive around because it's so big, and they've got these amazing wind tunnels to test the engines. So they do definitely make things.
It's really interesting what you say in relation to brand, because when you see something, you think, well, that company has made it. I mean, Apple is a major brand, and you think, well, Apple has made it, but actually they assemble it from component parts. And again, in Tim's presentation, he bought lots of phones, and he talked about the distance that component parts did travel. So this world that we live in is very complicated, but brand loyalty, perhaps one has to question whether it was really made by the people who think it is. Anyway, so we're going to get on now to really drilling down on what you think should really be measured.
So that's a big question, and I don't have a complete answer to it. So part of it, I think, is that we do need to think about these structural changes that are going on and understanding better what digital and now AI is going to do to us. I do have one paper about how to think about measuring AI, but it's going to be complicated. It's got a complicated supply chain. It's bundled into lots of existing products. And so should I be thinking about the price of telecom services through my iPhone? How would I attribute some of that value to the AI that I can now get through having ChatGPT or DeepSeek on there? We can measure some of the inputs, we can measure the energy use, and that's important to track. But what value, how do you think about what value AI use is creating now? It's really not obvious to me. And what about AI agents?
Yeah.
If you follow what's going on in AI world, it's all about agents. They're calling them claws, OpenClaw, Maltbook, a lot of releasing of these essentially bots that autonomously go and do things. So the industry thinks they'll be huge. Should I be counting them as economic agents whose GDP, will they have their own GDP? You know, the conceptual Wild West in terms of thinking about AI. So digital is bad enough so far, that's going to get harder, and I think we really need to think about that. We need to think much more about supply chains in the world we're in and mapping that better, because that's about economic security, about economic resilience, and how many more examples do we need of how that can go wrong before we start to measure it properly? Beyond that, I think about what we should be measuring in terms of what's called in the literature comprehensive wealth. You could think of the national accounts and GDP as being like a profit and loss for a company. They tell you the flow of what's going on over a period of time. But you wouldn't judge the health of a company without looking at its balance sheet as well. So the analogy is economies have a portfolio of assets, of resources that they can use, either to consume now, this year, or to consume in future. So once you introduce the balance sheet concept, you immediately embed the sustainability question, which is obviously very important. Now, there's been a lot of headway on measuring natural capital, because to anybody outside certain people in the United States, I guess, the importance of climate change and biodiversity loss is very clear. So the statistical agencies have done a lot of work on that. We're starting to embed natural capital. It needs to go a lot further because the valuations used are market-based valuations, but there are lots of externalities in nature that we would want to understand better. But there are other assets as well, and economists are not very romantic people, as you know, so we call people human capital. Again, that is measured to some extent, but mainly by how much can people earn doing their jobs, which is, or how educated are they in terms of conventional academic qualifications. Now, in itself, that's not a great metric of skill and the capacity of the economy. It also, though, omits health. And post-pandemic, it's pretty clear that omitting health and longevity in your human capital metric is not a great idea. Infrastructure, we don't measure well. Digital infrastructure, who knows where the internet is? But also, what we focus on in the Bennett School is social infrastructure. This is a bit of social infrastructure that's not doing too well. I think this is the basement of a courtroom somewhere, and you can see the state it's in. The public realm, as we all know, is getting a bit shabby. The point about social infrastructure, which includes the court system, schools and hospitals, but also public transport. Do you have facilities for young people to gather, or pubs and shops locally? the whole set of things that are not individually owned, but make a place the kind of place where people can get on and do the things they want to do, capture the economic opportunities they want. So we are arguing that's a really important part of the nation's asset base. You could think about heritage capital, which inspires people's creativity and well-being. So all of these types of capital, some of them physical things that in principle look easy to measure, some of them much more intangible, some of them individual, some of them social. All of these add up to a map of the sustainability of your economy and the resilience of the people in it, their ability to do the things they want to do. So last March 2025, the United Nations adopted a new set of definitions for GDP in the national accounts. Later the same month, the Secretary General of the United Nations said, I don't think this GDP thing tells us what we want to know. We're going to have another expert working group on can we come up with something better. That group's due to report quite soon, and I think they're going to recommend something like this kind of comprehensive wealth approach, which I think will be a big step forward. It's a big job, because if you even think about natural capital, there are lots of parts of that we don't measure very well, even in physical terms. Something like, soil quality, or a comprehensive picture of air quality and water quality. So there's a lot of data gathering to be done, but a lot of conceptual work to be done as well. Because if you think about all of these things as a portfolio, they affect each other. And we should be making decisions taking those relationships into account. If you're thinking about flood prevention, for instance, you could build concrete through town, or you could plant trees upland and sustain the wetland downstream. And you might look at those in investment terms, what's the return to each way of doing that? But then if you think about the human health benefits of the alternatives, you would add human health benefits to the green route, and that should be taken into account as well. So it's a different kind of framework, but it does, I think, point us towards a more sustainable and resilient economy. Also, it creates a lot of work for people who do economic measurement things, so that would be a good outcome in my book.
What interests me about this is it could, well, there's two things I'd think about. One is that people could go off and do their own thing and do something slightly different. So you've already said that there's a new working group being set up to look at how to do this. So there could be different ways of measuring it. So if you change something, you run the risk of splintering the way you do it. I'm interested in your thoughts on that. But I'm also interested on your thoughts about how feasible this would be for countries that, sort of in low-income countries that may not have the infrastructure and the financial backing to be able to do this sorts of work. So I wonder what your thoughts are about those 2 points.
Both great questions. On the first one, there are already plenty of alternative ways of looking at economic progress. There's a social progress indicator. The OECD has something called the Better Life Index. Plenty of dashboards. Some people advocate for measuring well-being directly, which you do by surveying people, asking them to scale what they feel like. And it does splinter attention. And that, for me, is part of the reason the hold of GDP has been so tenacious, because it is organized through an international process under the United Nations. You sort of need something for people to switch to that has enough consensus about it, which is why I like the comprehensive wealth approach, because it brings in the economic theory and the statisticians can buy into it. It's already got traction in that professional community. And it does make sense to people. You can explain it intuitively. But it's certainly not the only way. And there are sort of tactical arguments for thinking about that versus other approaches. On the capacity question, I think that's a really important question. And it's already difficult for low-income countries to do the GDP measurement that countries like the UK would do. I think the answer will lie partly in using new methods and new techniques. So satellite imagery, sensor data in urban environments in low-income countries, mobile phone data. There are plenty of data sources to use that would help. The catch is that they're often in private hands. And the statistical system at the moment has this real problem that official agencies are underfunded or being directly attacked in the United States. And in fact, there's an article in Nature about this week. And the amount of data held in private hands is growing, and they do not share it, partly for understandable commercial reasons, but partly because it's not part of their social license to operate. And I think that's got to change. They've got to start making it available. So that's actually part of the task that lies ahead of us.
And just a diversion, I was appearing for British Science Week yesterday with Patrick Vallance on a kind of a platform. It was a Teams call, and we were talking about how to make data to make people sort of trust it and believe that it's transparent. And actually, we're talking about how important it is to actually make data publicly available, and then people can actually replicate what you've done and sort of double check it and make sure that they agree with it, because not everybody will be able to do that. But actually, if you put the source data out, then that leads to greater trust and obviously transparency. So this idea that people have got the data behind closed doors, that leads to all sorts of issues, including the ones that you're talking about.
I do talk to people in the big tech companies, and I say, look, guys, the story about tech is that it's going to destroy the world. It'll destroy your job on the way to doing that, and by the way, it'll drive your teenager to suicide. You've got to, it would serve you well to get some more information about what the impacts are out there.
Just ask people what they want. So one of the things we were talking about before we started was time as an alternative perspective, and I asked you, tell me more about that. That sounds really interesting, but you're going to tell us now.
Who thinks they have enough time to do all they want to do? One person yeah. Put their hand up. 2 people, okay.
You notice you and I don't put our hands up.
We don't put our hands up at all. So it's a really nice accounting framework, because you've got 24 hours and you can't save them, you've got to spend them. So we could think about the value to ourselves and to the economy of how we spend our time. And you could think about that very directly as, you could measure people's well-being in different activities, and there have been plenty of studies doing that. So people hate commuting. Let's make their journeys faster. That's an immediate policy benefit. It's a good productivity metric also, because it affects productivity in one of 2 ways. One is it speeds things up. Technologies have always speeded things up. Sailing ships were slower than steamships, and we now send messages at the speed of light rather than down copper wire. So speed is quite a good productivity metric. If you have a blood test, you want it to come back to you as quickly as possible. But the other metric is to think about the quality of the time in service activities. And so if you're very ill, having a lot of highly skilled people spend high quality time caring for you is an alternative, but also equally good productivity metric. So I think it's very interesting at the moment, because the technology is changing so much how we use our time. And some of those changes are good. We had the checkouts. We've got to do the work ourselves, but actually it's faster than standing in line at the conveyor belt. We can do our online banking much faster, all kinds of things we can do faster, but also it eats all our time watching the adverts that you get served on Instagram.
So I won't ask us to calculate the value of sitting here for an hour, Diane. So I think the value has been very high. So we're going to move on a little. We've kind of got another 5 minutes before we turn to Q&A. We cannot possibly end this conversation without talking about political economy. So, polarised voting, next generation's worse off than us, etc. And you also have to tell us about China's GDP song as well as part of this. So tell us about political economy. Clearly, kind of the GDP song is a bit of fun, but there's some very serious things going on in the world right now, which will really impact our economies around the world. So can you give us some thoughts on that?
So the story that the GDP figures tell, I think, has become decreasingly consistent with what people experience in their everyday lives. the growth rate in the Western economies has slowed down since the financial crisis, but GDP has continued to grow. Politicians have continued to emphasize GDP growth. And over this period, a lot of people on median incomes and below have seen their real purchasing power not increase at all. And so they're not experiencing it very directly in that way. But more than that, the market economy just isn't working well. People have the experience of trying to get a GP appointment, of being online to their bank forever to try to get something fixed. So all of these things that were meant to bring convenience to us are not doing. The food industry is processing food and making us obese, and I think that message has come home. The insurance industry doesn't want to pay out insurance. So everything has become a struggle in the market economy. The digital tools have created friction. Cory Doctorow has this book. He's got this unlovely term of enshittification for the way that the digital experience has actually degraded everyday life rather than improving it, as the promise seemed to be. And so this disjunction has become really quite powerful, and the public realm as well, as we were just talking about. People's lives have not been getting better, and the figures have been going up. So I think telling people more growth is the answer really just doesn't ring true at the moment. And there are other trade-offs too, and so the Chinese GDP song, I couldn't get it to play for you, unfortunately, but there's the link if anybody wants to listen to it. I warn you, it's hip-hop, but it's a song about how China's rush for GDP growth has had environmental costs. And there's a very immediate trade-off there. Actually, their energy usage per pound, per yuan of GDP has been declining. They're switching to renewables quickly, but it has had a real environmental cost. So on the one hand, they've experienced real gains in incomes, but on the other hand, that cost is clear. And so for me, part of the explanation of why we've become so polarized, and there's no single explanation, obviously, it is about that disjunction between what they're told is going on in the economy and what they're experiencing. And this was true as far back as Brexit. I'm sure people know the story about Anand Menon doing a talk about Brexit, and he talked about GDP going up so much under the EU, and somebody in the audience called out, "That's your GDP, not mine." So this is, a decade-old problem or more.
Okay. Salutary. Before we open up to questions then, what next for you on the statistics agenda?
Well, I am still very interested in what AI and digital are doing. So the data question that we talked about is something I'd like to do more on, because there are trade-offs there. Data use is exploding, and it is helping the AI engineers create increasingly sophisticated models that can be very useful once we figure out what to do with them. But there are clear trade-offs. They've got a lot of data. They want to keep it confidential for commercial reasons and for reasons of market power. What are we going to do about that? There are privacy trade-offs, clearly, and it's right to be very concerned about that. The government would want to open some data, but apart from privacy, would also like to cover the costs, because investing in maintaining secure databases is expensive. So the trade-off for the government is, what should they charge to whom? And there's a trade-off there. And should they have different rules for different kinds of users? Should they be perfectly happy to sell all of the UK's health data to large American tech companies, or would there be other considerations there? So thinking about the data value chain in different uses, and who creates that value and who captures that value, I think has become a fundamentally important question in transport, in healthcare, in AI itself, in the creative sector. Lots of really quite thorny issues that policymakers don't really know how to grapple with. So I'm very interested in that. I'm also interested in this question of what institutions and social capital do we need to sustain healthy communities and a growing, resilient economy. Social capital, not even less well measured than any other kind of infrastructure. And so can we bring some clarity to how we think about that and how we know whether or not it's getting better? And some of this you shouldn't be trying to put into numbers, so the qualitative experience matters too. but I'm a numbers gal, so I shall try and do some numbers.
Well, I think you're going to have a busy decade plus with so much more to do. So thank you so much, Diane, and this has been really interesting. So thank you.
Thank you.
So this is the bit where we open up to any questions from the audience. And so we have Annabelle and Amy who are ready with the microphones. Please put up your hands if you have a question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the insightful talk. I was thinking if there is currently any, I know it's a work in progress, but something almost ideal to adopt by the governments and policymakers. Giving an example, I think Jeffrey Sachs has proposed a new alternative for the GDP, which includes the sustainable development and environmental factors. Are these alternatives which is being discussed or sometimes adopted by Bhutan and other governments are really ideal, or you still think we don't have any strong alternative for the GDP till now? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, this goes a little bit to the fragmentation point. There are lots of alternatives, and in a sense, there are too many alternatives, and it would be good to reduce that number so that you can bring the machinery of government and statistical agencies and economic thinkers behind the one or two things that you think might be better alternatives to GDP. I mean, having GDP itself emerged in the depths of the crisis of the Second World War, when Keynes wrote a pamphlet called How to Pay for the War, his complaint being that he had no idea what was available for citizens to consume and what was available to continue the war effort. He needed those aggregate numbers. And so that crisis drove a unitary path for people to figure out how to measure the economy. And I think of it as like a technical standard. If you're changing from driving on the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the road, you need everybody to agree to do it. So I think we're in that moment when people see there's a need for change, and there are lots of great ideas emerging, but we all need to agree on the one thing to do so we can do the switch over.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. Yeah, excuse me. If we did measure the assets in the economy and not just the profit and loss in the UK, how's that trending? I presume you've done some of that because you've written all about it. So what are the sort of trends in those measurements? Where are we going?
The ones that are measured in the aggregate are human capital, which was trending up significantly because of increasing skill levels, the proportion of people going to university and so on. As I said, the way it's done doesn't yet include health. And if you look at the fact that increases in longevity have plateaued, and we've got things like long COVID, it's probably leveled out, but those figures are not there. The health figures aren't included. Natural capital has generally been in decline, and that's global. And I think we can pretty clearly experience that, with pockets of improvement. So air quality in cities that have emissions controls, for instance, has been improving. But overall, it's a negative picture on natural capital, a positive one on human capital. I would guess it's a pretty negative one on infrastructure, physical infrastructure, because a lot of that investment was done in the post-war decades, and we're going through a cycle where it needs replacing, and there'll need to be more infrastructure investment. But that comprehensive balance sheet we don't have anywhere.
Hi, my name is John Thackeray. Thank you very much for the talk. So I have effectively the same questions I had for Tim Minshall, which is you have a lot of very nice propositions, valuing natural capital and all of those kinds of things, and yet we live in a political environment where, for example, in this country and in the USA, people are being told the most important thing to make your life better is to expel immigrants. How are you going to get people to vote for something that doesn't appeal to those kind of instincts?
Oh, gosh. Demography is going to play a part. We're going to run out of people. Labour supply will shrink. We're all worried about what AI will do to the demand for workers, but there are clear needs for an increasing workforce in some areas. And immigrant labour has filled a lot of that gap to date. I suppose I have a faint hope that a different measurement framework would actually help improve people's lives enough that they didn't need the shibboleth of it's all the immigrants' fault. I used to be on the Migration Advisory Committee, and if you do the standard econometric work, immigration has been a net contributor to GDP growth, and that's pretty clear in the evidence. It obviously doesn't speak to people. And my hypothesis about that was always that it was about that gap between GDP growth and their daily experience. And so if you're seeing immigrants who cluster in certain areas, putting pressure on public services, so you can't get the doctor's appointment, and the quality of your local environment is declining because the high street has shops closing and so on. My hypothesis is that addressing the economy of place, what it's like where people live and what their everyday experience is like, might start to chip away at that kind of sentiment. But I don't know.
Well, I have a question that the new metrics like time use and social capital need the hypergranular data, and that kind of data the big techs already have, and it can lead to, if we want to make a perfect progress metric, it can inherently risk the mass surveillance state.
Yeah, that's a good question. You might argue that because the big companies have that data, they already have that capacity. I don't think for the kinds of metrics that you need to govern an economy well as a policymaker, you need the granular detail. So aggregation over certain categories is adequate. And of course, how you construct that granular data matters as well. So one of the examples I give in the book is the way that we categorize people by ethnicity or cultural background, and the increasing granularity with which that has happened over time. So that, you know, if you fill out these forms, the number of options has increased dramatically over the decades. What's the point of that? What do we need it for? And I'm not sure, you know, so the high-minded answer to that would be, well, you need it to figure out who's not doing so well so that you can help them better. I'm not sure that's how it's used, and I'm sure some of you know that in France you're not allowed to collect that kind of data because every citizen is equal in the Republic. And so there are normative choices being made in, as I think you're alluding to, in how you classify and structure the data and how granular you need that data to be. So I think case by case you have to figure out what the trade-offs are and take very seriously, as the tech companies mostly do, the privacy implications of using the data.
I think that's right. And when I was talking about letting data go into the public domain, of course, I was talking about anonymized data, which couldn't be traced to anybody. Yeah. And that can have huge benefits. But the disbenefits is, of course, if people can trace back to the source, then that's clearly not acceptable. So that's a big data issue.
Hello, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. In the 1980s, there was 3 million unemployed. And one of the ways they got the unemployment down was by changing the way they counted the unemployed. And also, I think there's a lot of people with the inflation figures these days. If you talk to people in the street, they'll say they don't believe the inflation figures. And they'll perhaps start talking about what's put in that basket in order to keep inflation seemingly as low as possible. So I just want to ask whether if we're going to change the way we measure wealth via, not via GDP, how can we be comforted that it's not simply, the people of Whitehall trying to manipulate the numbers in order to hide the fact we're getting poorer?
So the numbers are always going to be political. There's a reason William Petty called his book Political Arithmetic, and the aim in his case was to figure out how much tax could be raised to fight the Napoleonic Wars, or whichever wars it was. I was a journalist during the 1980s when they kept changing the definition of unemployment. I would say it didn't fool anybody. People knew what was going on, and the sort of political trick was very easily exposed. I think one of the big hurdles to looking at the wealth accounts rather than just GDP growth is that it might show that we haven't been growing as fast as we think because of the decline in natural capital. And the agencies are meant to switch to using net GDP to net off some of the depletion of resources and impact of climate damage and so on. We'll see how that goes, because you're absolutely right to say the numbers are political, and ultimately these are political choices.
Is there a question at the back?
Thank you, Diane. Even within the existing framework, I would have thought net national product per capita would be a more immediately direct measure of how well we've been doing. And obviously there are all sorts of things that leaves out. But is the problem there that we don't measure depreciation properly? You pointed out that the infrastructure is falling to bits. And clearly, in some sense, the previous generations were living off the capital that we're now going to have to replace, and we're feeling poorer for that. But in some sense, they weren't living as well as they thought they were.
I think you're right to say it's a question about not having a full measure of depreciation. And that could be in the natural sphere, but also infrastructure. And as far as I know, that's not depreciated at all, whereas we can see from everyday experience that it clearly has been depreciating. One of my nerdy sidelines at the moment is to think about the depreciation of data. Data, for the first time, will be included in the measure of the asset base of the economy and GDP. But the Office of National Statistics and its equivalents don't know how to depreciate it. And so they're going, well, software depreciates over 5 years, so let's do that. But data's got different uses. And so the data that's needed from road sensors and traffic sensors for autonomous vehicles will depreciate very quickly. You need it second by second. Whereas marketing data, so Amazon can sell you another book about economics, that hardly depreciates at all. So I think the depreciation is a serious question. I mean, obviously, there are other measures that might get better at everyday experience. You could look at median household income, and that figure is available. And that goes back to the politics question, really. What is it that determines what we look at? And the grip of GDP growth is very tenacious. And that's partly because it does, to some extent, measure whether things are good or bad.
There's a Jim over on the left.
So I was just thinking about what you were saying, not too close to the microphone, sorry. I was just thinking about what you were saying about whether things are good or bad. In the 70s and 80s, a lot of historians have spent quite a bit of time looking at how the consequences of us understanding, perhaps erroneously, that things were declining, GDP versus Germany, for example. The consequences of those things, even if we were slightly mistaken about the size of those changes, led to quite real experiences of decline. And I was just wondering, really, then, is there a way to step away from growth, regardless of whether it's GDP or some other measure? Is there a way to step away from an obsession with growth as being the cornerstone of whether you're succeeding, and ergo whether things are good or not?
That's a really interesting question. It wasn't until around the early 60s that growth of GDP rather than the level of GDP came to matter so much. because in Keynesian theory, it's the level that matters for the employment level, which is what his concern was in the general theory. And then the Cold War and the rivalry between the US and the USSR led the OECD in its former guise to focus on growth as what we really cared about. I guess the sense in which I think it matters in an underlying way is people's experience since the Industrial Revolution that for the next generations things will be better. And that generation by generation that has pretty much been the experience. And my sense is that that is what might be shifting for people now.
Any other questions? We're nearly at the end. Tim.
Diane, great stuff. Could you comment a little bit more on the AI side of things? Because there seem to be two angles there. One was it's having such a distorting effect on everything, the way it does stuff, but also by having tools of that incredible power and almost exponential increase in power, we could use it to help better understand what's going on.
So it's a big debate at the moment among economists because it's early days for actually using AI around the economy. And I think it was the Federal Reserve Board of Dallas or St. Louis put out a chart where they showed the trend in GDP growth carried forward from previous years. They showed existential risk from AI, which people in the industry take very seriously, and that had GDP going down to 0. And then they had, but it could become self-fulfilling, it could become a self-perpetuating, a perpetual motion machine for the economy. And then they had a chart that went off to infinity and beyond. So there's just real uncertainty at the moment about what its ultimate economic impacts will be. There's a very negative sense in the media about it. It's including, well, we're using it in our work, but it's making us work harder because we can do so much more. We're even shorter of time than we already were. Organizations say that they're adopting AI, but we don't really know what they're doing with it, and they're not doing on the whole, the end-to-end change in processes that really drive big productivity gains, like just-in-time manufacturing in the 90s. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, Tim, I think it's a bit too early to answer that question, but I'm really interested in keeping an eye, how do we keep an eye on it as it goes along? And to be fair to tech companies, they're starting to put a lot of effort into thinking about economic impacts as well.
Thank you. So we're drawing to a close pretty much now. I'll make a couple of announcements, then I have a quick question for you just to close the session. The announcements are that we've got a wonderful reception in the Buttery that you can all join us for at 7 o'clock. So I look forward to seeing you there where you can ask more questions. So Diane, you've got some books that you're able to sign there. So if you'd like to purchase a book, then please feel free, and you'll be able to see when you go outside where you can do that. But before we close, I do have a question. So you're in a kind of a building, and you can just see Sir Keir Starmer just about to get into the lift, and you sprint up, and you get in the lift with him, and you've got about 5 floors to go. What would you tell him about GDP? What would you want him to hear?
I would want him to hear that you're not going to increase GDP in your fiscal headroom by cutting the things that increase GDP.
That's about 2 floors, but that sounds pretty good to me.
They're treating it like an entity that's out there that they can't shape. And actually what GDP will be next year that will determine what they can spend to keep the bond markets happy is affected by the investment decisions they make now. So they ought to be thinking about what they'll invest in for the economy to grow, for people to lead good lives, and that will increase GDP.
Well, I hope your phone starts ringing when you get home to give advice. That would be great. Well, Diane, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure, and so I'd like to give you a massive round of applause and then invite everybody outside to continue this conversation. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.